865, that just, I figured just bad writing. I never can read anything that I write. That's why I type everything out on the computer. At least if I want to read it later on. If you would be turning over to 2 John, our study is going to be from there this evening, primarily. Just about all of it, but I do want to express appreciation for each of you being back this evening. And we'll remind you, if you want one of the books from spring on fellowship from God or man, to let Denise know. I will be leaving Saturday to drive there, and so the time is just about up for you to let her know if you want one of those books. The subject that I'll be speaking on there actually is this: by what biblical authority does one church withdraw fellowship from a sister congregation? The Bible does explicitly state that a congregation is to withdraw fellowship from certain individuals. When individuals sin and they are impenitent in that sin, then the church has the obligation to withdraw fellowship from that individual. The question that we're faced with, though, does the Bible also teach that that's true in relationship to one congregation to another congregation? The Bible does not explicitly state that regarding congregations. But that's not the only way that the Bible teaches. The Bible also teaches by implication. And what we are seeing as we have studied through this is that by implication, one congregation is to withdraw fellowship from another congregation. We started looking at several Bible verses dealing with this subject. We studied first Amos 3 and verse 3. Can two walk together except they be agreed? That there has to be an agreement. And that while it's dealing with the prophet and God, the application can also be made to two sister congregations if they're not walking together. And that is, one of them is not walking together with God and the other one is, then in order to continue walking with God, the congregation that is walking with God would have to withdraw its fellowship from that congregation that is not. So can two walk together except they be agreed? Then we studied some principles from Acts 9 and verse 26 when Saul tried to join himself with the congregation at Jerusalem. He was at Damascus, or had been at Damascus, comes to Jerusalem, and they rejected him at first. And we learned several principles regarding fellowship from that. Then in Romans 16, verses 17 and 18, where Paul tells them to mark and those who cause divisions and offenses contrary to the doctrine that you've learned, and avoid them. Well, there's the marking and the avoiding. But is it only if it's individuals? What if it's congregation that's causing divisions and offenses contrary to the doctrine? Wouldn't the obligation be the same then? Well, of course it would. In 2 Corinthians 6, verses 14 through verse 18, that we're not to be unequally yoked together with unbelievers. And he goes through a series of questions showing that those of God cannot have fellowship with those of Satan or the things of Satan. What if there was a congregation that was now in that category of things of Satan? Would those things of God be able to continue in fellowship with them? Well, of course not. In Ephesians 5 and verse 11, what fellowship, or to have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness, but rather reprove them. And again, the question, what if there's a congregation that comes into that category now of an unfruitful work of darkness? Should a congregation continue its fellowship or withdraw its fellowship? Obviously, from this, we would see that it would have to withdraw its fellowship. Then we studied 1 John 1, verses 3 through 8, how that fellowship is one with another because of our fellowship with God. And only as we are in fellowship with God can we have fellowship with others. Is that true of only individuals, or would it not also be true of congregations? Well, why wouldn't it be? Congregation is just made up of several individuals. And so, if one no longer is walking in the light, then he no longer has fellowship with God, and he would not have fellowship with other faithful congregations. Now then, that brings us to our lesson this evening. And specifically, we're going to look at verses 7 through verse 11 of 2 John. But hope you have your Bibles and that you'll turn there, because we're going to really be covering the entire chapter to a certain extent. But John writes here in these verses, "For many deceivers are entered into the world, who confess not that Jesus Christ is come in the flesh. This is a deceiver and an antichrist. Look to yourselves that we lose not those things which we have wrought, but that we receive a full reward. Whosoever transgresseth and abideth not in the doctrine of Christ hath not God. He that abideth in the doctrine of Christ, he hath both the Father and the Son. If there come any unto you, and bring not this doctrine, receiving not into your house, neither bidding God speed. For he that biddeth in God speed is partaker of his evil deeds." As we look at this section here, we are introduced to 4 injunctions, or 4 commands. The first of those is that we are to love. And that's actually back in verse 5, when he says, "Now I beseech thee, lady, not as though I wrote a new commandment unto thee, but that which we had from the beginning, that we love one another." Thus an injunction, a command, that's what an injunction is, a command that we're to love one another. And certainly that is a command that we see set forth throughout the Scriptures for Christians to love one another. By this, Jesus says, the world will know that you're my disciples if you have love one toward another. And so love is a command, and is commanded for each one of us in relationship to our relations with others, and certainly in our relationship with God. A second injunction is that of obedience, and we see that in verse 6. This is love, that we walk after his commandments. This is the commandment, that as ye have heard from the beginning, ye should walk in it. So here's the commandment. What is it? To walk after his commandments. And that, of course, is in dealing with our love for God. This is the love of God, that ye keep his commandments. And his commandments are not grievous, is what John had written in chapter 5 of 1 John in verse 3. So here is that second injunction, or that command, to be obedient to God and to his will. We discussed that a little bit this morning in relationship to the term gospel, and how that it is, yes, ordinance containing, and as we keep those ordinances, then we have the promises that God gives. But it's only as we are obedient to those ordinances that God had set forth, or being obedient to his commands, walking after his commands, that we will receive that obedience. The third injunction is that to vigilance. And we see that in verses 7 through 9. Many deceivers are entered into the world, who confess not that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh. This is a deceiver and an antichrist. Look to yourselves that you lose not those things which we have wrought, but that we receive a full reward. Whosoever transgresseth and abideth not in the doctrine of Christ hath not God. He that abideth in the doctrine of Christ, he hath both the Father and Son. And so here is a command of vigilance, to watchfulness. You be watchful. Why? Because there are many deceivers in the world. And as we look at our society, and even within the Lord's church, we see the truthfulness of this statement of John, that there are many deceivers in the world. And we'll come back to this aspect of many deceivers, but there are many deceivers in the world, and we are to be watchful, be vigilant concerning those deceivers. The fourth injunction that is found in this is that of refusal of error in verses 10 and verse 11. If there come any unto you, and bring not this doctrine, receiving not into your house, neither bidding God speed. For he that biddeth in God speed is partaker of his evil deeds. And so you refuse those who would bring error. You have no fellowship with them. You don't allow him into your house. You don't bid him God speed. And thus a refusal of error, or those who would teach error. And so we start off in looking at this with these four injunctions. Now then I want us to go back to this aspect that there are many deceivers in the world. Deceivers is very simply those who would lead people astray. Individuals who will corrupt the truth, that will teach false doctrine. They are deceiving individuals. As we see within our society, in the religious world in general, Christendom as it is generally referred to, we see deceivers all around us. And what happens? People follow them. They are deceived by these false teachers because of their smooth speech and their smooth words, or that which they speak is so easy for the people. And so people are led astray. They are deceivers. John, in this book, mentions one type of deceiver. That is, those who deny that Christ came in the flesh. That individual, he says, is a deceiver. Now then, there were a group of individuals at that day and time that John writes called the Gnostics. The Gnostics denied even the very possibility that Christ could come in the flesh. Now then, to try and shorten this to a very brief aspect, you have to understand a little bit of terminology. Because Jesus, their terminology, Jesus was a man, Christ was spirit, and since all flesh is evil, spirit is good, there can be no connection between them. Thus, Christ, spirit, cannot come in the flesh. Or they would say, Christ could not be Jesus, because there's no possibility of spirit man, or a spirit God, being in conjunction with or connected with man, spirit, or flesh. And thus, they denied the very possibility that Christ could come in the flesh. They are antichrist, he says. They are opposed to, and that's the idea of anti-Christ, they are opposed to Christ. That's one type of deceiver that John is dealing with. That one who was a Gnostic who denied that Jesus came in the flesh. Let me add, there are a lot of other antichrists today even. The Jehovah's Witnesses and their denial that Jesus is God are antichrist. The premillennialists of our day, as most religious groups hold to the premillennial doctrine, and more specifically dispensational premillennialism, they are antichrist. They deny that Jesus, or that Christ, is king now. They say he might be king in prospect, he will be king later on, but they're denying his kingship now. They are antichrist. John is dealing with one specific type of antichrist, the Gnostics who denied the possibility that Christ could come in the flesh. I almost said Jesus, but that would have been wrong as far as terminology is concerned, that Christ could come in the flesh. That's the deceivers that John is dealing with specifically in this book. And he is teaching us that we must always watch. We must be vigilant against, yes, those deceivers that deny the possibility that Christ could come in the flesh, the Gnostic. They had to be watchful about that. They had to be on guard against those Gnostics, lest they be led astray by them. But the same principle would hold true concerning any false doctrine, any type of deceiver. The same thing is being said of any deceiver. while he's dealing with one specific type of deceiver. Because those who would deceive us will lead us astray from God's will, so that we're no longer keeping God's will and will destroy our Christian service. That eventually will lead to our eternal damnation, losing our reward in heaven if we follow a deceiver. Thus, be on guard. And only by our remaining faithful to God can we enjoy heaven as our home. Now then, we come to this phrase, though, that's found in verse 9, the doctrine of Christ. And he says there, whosoever transgresseth and abideth not the doctrine of Christ. We want to look at that phraseology in that term. He states very clearly that when one transgresses the doctrine of Christ, does not remain within that doctrine of Christ, then he is separated from God. He hath not God. Only as we remain within that doctrine of Christ do we have God. We have the Father and the Son. And so it's important for us to understand what is this doctrine of Christ. There are two main positions that are taken concerning this phrase. And that would be true whether you're talking about denominational people or even those within the Lord's church. There are two main positions. And the terminologies that are used is it's either an objective genitive or a subjective genitive. An objective genitive is the doctrine about Christ. In other words, the teaching about Christ, that Christ could come in the flesh. That's all that it's dealing with is the deity of Christ. The other is subjective genitive, which basically says the teaching which comes from Christ, or the entirety of the New Testament teaching, to put it in simple terms for us, while the objective genitive is that which is dealing with what our belief is concerning Jesus of Nazareth and whether he is God in the flesh. And so the teaching about Christ, or the teaching that comes from Christ. Objective genitive, about him. Subjective genitive, all of his teachings. Which is it? Why is it important also? It's important because it's going to determine our fellowship. There are some, and I'll go ahead and add this and then come back to that. There are some who will say that it's both, objective and subjective genitive. There are some others who say it doesn't make any difference. Well, it does make a difference. The difference is if it is objective genitive, if it's only the teaching about the deity of Christ, then only that one who no longer believes in the deity of Christ is one that we are to withdraw from. If it's the totality of teaching in the New Testament, then that individual who does not have God is that individual who transgresses all of or any of God's teachings or Christ's teachings that is found within the pages of the New Testament. Whereas objective says, oh no, if, let's take instrumental music, premillennialism, Pentecostalism, Calvinism, doctrine of faith only. None of those make any difference as far as an individual having God. If it is objective genitive, as long as the person believes in the deity of Christ, then he has God. Now that's the difference that this makes. Well, obviously from what you're saying, you can see that I believe that it is subjective genitive. Now then, why, though? Why do I believe that it should be subjective genitive? Let me go back and just mention the aspect of the objective genitive. They would go back to verse 6 and 7 and dealing with, there are many deceivers in the world who confess that Christ has come in the flesh, or confess not that Christ has come in the flesh. This is a deceiver and an antichrist. And I say, see, that's the doctrine of Christ now. And it only applies to that. So that's the basic argument of those who would hold that it's objective genitive. I believe, as stated before, that it's dealing with the totality of the New Testament teaching, thus subjective genitive. Now then, let me give some reasons why. First, parallelism. That's the poetry of the Bible. And we generally think of parallelism as one line and then another line. We go to Psalms and we see one line says something and the next line says the same thing. And we see that that's synonymous parallelism. And there's other types of parallelism. Well, John is writing in parallelism. He's using the poetry, except it's not lines, it's sections. You have a section here, then he repeats that section, just using different terms, then he repeats it again. He's writing in synonymous parallelism, but it's sections, not lines. So understand it from that standpoint. Then, let's look at the book. That's why I say I'm just going to mention these. We don't have time to read every one of the verse. But if you look at verses 1, verse 2, verse 3, and verse 4, those first 4 verses, you will see an emphasis on the word truth. For example, the last part of verse 1, the truth. Start of verse 2, for the truth's sake. In verse 3, again, in truth and love. Verse 4, your children are walking in truth. So there's that emphasis on the word truth in those first 4 verses, that first section. Then, starting in verse 4, you see a change. We have received a commandment of the Father. So he changes from truth to commandment. But those are the same thing. He's not dealing with 2 different things here. He's dealing with the same thing. It's the same subject, just using different words. He again talks about the commandments. I wrote a new commandment in verse 5. In verse 6, that we walk after his commandments. Couldn't we just substitute the word that we walk after the truth? Well, of course we could. Isn't that exactly what he did back in relationship to this elect lady's children, that they were walking in the truth, and now then we are to walk in the truth, or commandments. Synonymous parallelism. Then he uses doctrine in verses 9 and verse 10. Whosoever transgresseth and abideth not in the doctrine of Christ. That's exactly the same thing as truth. It's exactly the same thing as commandments. He's not changing his subject. He's repeating the subject by using different terms. And again, in verse 10, if any come and bring not this doctrine. And so you have a synonymous parallelism where he is showing that they're the same thing. He's just using different terms through this. And that's, I just said, this is going to show us, as we look at these 3 terms, as we go through that book, that the thrust of the letter is, when you come down to verse 9, the doctrine of Christ, is subjective. It is his commandments. It is the truth that is found. It is the doctrine of Christ. What is it? The doctrine that comes from him. All of his teachings. All of his commandments. The truth. And it's not just simply the Antichrist doctrine or believing that Christ has come in the flesh. A second reason to believe it is the thrust of commandment keeping. John gives an emphasis within this book. You keep the commandments. You keep the truth. Again, notice the aspect of the term truth. The word truth in verse 2, the truth dwelleth in us. Verse 2 again, the truth shall be with us forever. In verse 3, John found the elect lady's children walking in truth. Again in verse 3, as we have received a commandment. As we skip down to verse 6, love is walking after His commandments. Verse 8, He encourages us to look to yourselves. Why? So that you will receive a full reward in verse 8. How are we going to receive a full reward? It's going to be by the obedience and by the truth dwelling in us, being with us forever, by our walking in truth, by our walking in His commandments. That's how we're going to receive a full reward, only by our being obedient to all of God's laws. Thus, when we come to that phrase, doctrine of Christ, those abiding in that doctrine of Christ have fellowship with God. What is it? Those who are obeying God's commandments, those who are walking in truth, who receive that commandment and walking in that commandment. What is it? The totality of the teachings of Christ, the totality of the New Testament. While those who do not abide in it, those who are not walking in the truth, those who are not receiving that commandment and walking after that commandment, they do not have fellowship with God. But not only does John give an emphasis to this aspect of commandment keeping within this book of 2 John, we can see it in other writings that he made. For example, in John the 14th chapter, in verse 15, he records Jesus saying, "If you love me, keep my commandments." There's commandment keeping, the emphasis of. Verse 21, "He that hath my commandments and keepeth them, he it is that loveth me, and he that loveth me shall be loved of my Father, and I will love him and will manifest myself to him." What is that if that's not having God? And how do we have God? Going back again to 2 John 9, by abiding within the doctrine of Christ. What is it? When we keep His commandments. Verses 23 through 24, again he emphasizes, "If a man love me, he will keep my words, and my Father will love him, and we will come unto him and make our abode with him. He that loveth me not keepeth not my sayings, and the word which ye hear is not mine, but the Father's which sent me." Again, here's an emphasis that John sets forth of commandment keeping. That is all of Christ's words or teachings. Turn over to the next chapter in John, the 15th chapter. In verse 10, again he records Jesus as saying, "If ye keep my commandments, ye shall abide in my love, even as I have kept my Father's commandments and abide in His love." And then in verse 14 he again states, "Ye are my friends, if ye do whatsoever I command you." So again, there's that emphasis, commandment keeping. You keep the commandments. We don't have time to go through all of the book of 1 John, but again, 1 John emphasizes this. I'll mention just chapter 5 and verse 2 and verse 3 of 1 John. "By this we know that we love the children of God, when we love God and keep His commandments. For this is the love of God, that we keep His commandments, and His commandments are not grievous." So there's an emphasis that John gives throughout his writings of keeping the commandments. So the emphasis that John gives to commandment keeping causes me to believe that this in verse 9 of 2 John, the doctrine of Christ, is the totality of his teachings. A third reason is the grammar itself. I realize that when we come to that phrase, the doctrine of Christ, that it is possible for it to be either one, objective or subjective, from a Greek grammar standpoint. But I think it's interesting. If we go back a few verses to verse 6, "And this is love, that we walk after His commandments. This is the commandment, that as ye have heard from the beginning, ye should walk in it." The phrase, His commandments could literally be translated the commandments of Him. That's the way it's written actually in the Greek language, just as the doctrine of Christ could be Christ's doctrine or Christ's teaching. It's exactly the same construction, His commandments in verse 6 and the doctrine of Christ in verse 9, as far as the grammar is concerned about it. If the commandments of Him and doctrine of Christ, then if the subjective in verse 6, His commandments, have reference to all of His commandments, why not the same phraseology and taking it exactly the same way in verse 9? All of His doctrine that He sets forth, all of His teachings. If it's only the doctrine of Christ being only about His deity, then what do we do with verse 6, which is exactly the same construction? It wouldn't make sense in verse 6 to take His commandments and make it only applicable to that view of the deity of Christ. Another reason is some parallel passages. In Matthew the 16th chapter, Jesus tells His disciples in verse 6, "Take heed and beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and of the Sadducees." His apostles misunderstood Jesus as a reproving of them, thinking that, well, maybe it's because we didn't bring any bread, physical food to eat. And so that's why He's saying this, beware the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees, that has to deal with physical food. So they had a misunderstanding of what Jesus was stating here. So Jesus explains it in verse 12. And then it says, "Then understood they how that He bade them not to beware of the leaven of bread," that's the physical food, "but of the doctrine of the Pharisees and of the Sadducees." Now then, we could ask the question, rightly so, when we come to that phrase, the doctrine of the Pharisees, and thus the doctrine of the Sadducees, is it the doctrine about them, the teaching about the Pharisees, or the teachings about the Sadducees? What would there be to beware about the teaching about them? No, Jesus is bidding them, you beware their teaching. And so when we see this construction again, doctrine of the Pharisees, doctrine of the Sadducees, we recognize that it is the doctrine that they are teaching, not the teaching about them. Why wouldn't we hold the same thing in relationship to the doctrine of Christ in 2 John 9? Then, another parallel passage would be Acts 2 and verse 42. That they continued steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine and fellowship and in breaking of bread and in prayers. This phrase, apostles' doctrine, again, is the same construction as doctrine of Christ in 2 John 9. It could be translated again, the doctrine of the apostles, and rightly so. It's easier, and we generally don't speak it that way as our English language uses. We use apostles' doctrine. But it's the same construction as doctrine of Christ in 2 John 9. Now then, the question we're faced with, is it the doctrine about the apostles? They continued steadfastly in the doctrine about the apostles. Well, what about the apostles? Was that even important? No. It was the teaching which they were giving, the doctrine which they were giving, the doctrine which they taught. And they were abiding, they continued steadfastly in that doctrine which the apostles were teaching. Doctrine which came from them. Same would be true in 2 John 9 when we come to the doctrine of Christ. It's not the doctrine about Him, it is the doctrine which He taught. Then, another reason that I believe that it is dealing with the entirety of His teaching is because of the Bible's teaching as a whole. The Bible's entirety teaching on the limits of fellowship And that goes back to what we've been studying all through this series of lessons dealing with the limits of fellowship. This understanding of it being the doctrine of Christ, being the doctrine which He taught, corresponds and is harmonious with the entirety of the Bible's teaching on the limits of fellowship. The only reason, really, to think that that phrase, doctrine of Christ, is about His deity is because, very simply, some individuals do not want to be confined by the limits of biblical fellowship. Let me give one illustration of that. Rubel Shelley, at one time, a very staunch defender of truth. He taught the truth, very faithful in his service to God. And if you'd listen to him dealing with, and the writings can be produced, this phrase in 2 John 9, doctrine of Christ, he stated exactly the same thing that I would be stating today, that it is the teaching that comes from Christ. But then he changed his view. He now believes that it's doctrine about Christ's deity, and that it's limited to that. And what has he done? He's made a change within his doctrine of fellowship, so that now then he can accept anyone who accepts the deity of Christ. That's why they go to this view of it's the doctrine about Christ, so that they can fellowship those individuals in the denominational world. Anyone who believes that Jesus Christ is God, they can then fellowship. Extend fellowship with Him, because according to this verse now they have God. And why he came up with his little book, Big F and Little F Fellowship. I'm still in Big F fellowship with them because they believe in the deity of Christ. And thus they have God. Even though I might not agree with them dealing with this subject and that subject and all of these other subjects, I may not agree with them, and so I don't have little F fellowship with them, but I'll still have Big F fellowship with them. Why? Because they believe in the doctrine of Christ. No, they don't. They believe that Christ is God, yes, but they don't believe in the doctrine of Christ as far as the totality of the New Testament teaching. That's why he changed, or that's what happens when they change their view dealing with that. It's because they want to broaden the limits of fellowship that God has set forth. Now then, one who goes beyond that doctrine, very simply, according to this verse, no longer has fellowship with God. He says very clearly, hath not God. That's not in fellowship with God. What if a congregation now, which at one time was faithful to the truth, or we might say faithful to the commandments, faithful to the doctrine of Christ, but they start transgressing that doctrine, that teaching, those commandments, then would it not be the case that that congregation now no longer has fellowship with God? They are severed from God. They hath not God. Let's ask the question also, here is a false teacher. Because verses 10 and 11, that injunction of vigilance and not receiving the false teacher. Don't bring him into your house, neither bidding God speed. Well, here comes one who is a false teacher. He's bringing a false doctrine who comes. We're not to receive him in our house. We're not to bid him Godspeed. That very basically is, we're not to do anything that would show that that individual is in fellowship with God or with us. We're not to bid him fellowship or Godspeed. That word Godspeed literally means a greeting. In some cases, it would mean shaking their hands, or going up and putting your arm around them and giving them encouragement. It's anything that we might do which would be interpreted by others or by that individual as an endorsement of his teachings and his actions. We cannot do those things that would be interpreted by them, you're in agreement with me. You think I'm in fellowship with you and in fellowship with God. We cannot do it. Doesn't matter what it is, because that would be a greeting in that sense. It would be bidding them Godspeed. We cannot in any way, shape, or form endorse their teachings nor their actions. But wouldn't it be just as wrong to bid Godspeed to an apostate congregation as an apostate individual? While this is dealing with an individual, yes. What about if it were a congregation that was the false teacher instead of the individual? Would we say that, well, we cannot fellowship the individual, we cannot bid him Godspeed, but here's the whole congregation, and because it's now a congregation, we have to extend fellowship to them. We cannot withdraw our fellowship. If the individual departs from Christ's teachings, we have to withdraw our fellowship. On the other hand, if a congregation abides in the teachings of Christ, then other congregations are going to be in fellowship with it. Even as one who is a teacher of truth, we would be in fellowship with that individual because that individual has God and we have God. But here now, we no longer have fellowship with one who departs from that teaching. Congregation or individual departs from Christ's doctrine, then other congregations would have to withdraw their fellowship from that congregation. Bidding Godspeed to one who is not in fellowship with God, if you skip down now to verse 11 of our text, for he that biddeth him Godspeed is a partaker of his evil deeds. Bidding Godspeed to one who is not in fellowship with God means that we are partakers of their evil. The word that's translated partaker here is elsewhere translated by the word fellowship. In other words, if we bid Godspeed to an individual who is no longer in fellowship with God, we are a fellowshipper of his evil. We're fellowshipping his evil. We become morally culpable of his evil. And thus we ourselves are separated from God. Let's use an illustration here. Here's an individual who comes and he's teaching that homosexuality is acceptable to God. We do those things that show our endorsement of him. Then we become morally culpable in relationship to his teaching that homosexuality is acceptable to God when it's not. It's clearly a violation of God's law. But we become just as morally culpable. We are subject to that aspect as he is. It's as if we are teaching that same doctrine that he is teaching. Even as when you fellowship that one who teaches truth, then you are fellowshipping the truth that he is teaching. When you endorse him, when you do those things to encourage that individual who's a teacher of truth, you're encouraging the truth that he's teaching. When you encourage someone who is a false teacher, you're encouraging the false teaching that he is doing. That's what we mean by morally culpable in their evil. And thus we become separated from God. But now then, if it's congregation, the situation is exactly the same. It doesn't change. If it's congregation that's teaching this doctrine, let's say, of homosexuality is acceptable to God, if we extend our fellowship with them, we're morally culpable in that situation. There's no difference between the two. And thus, if a congregation apostatizes, it starts teaching false doctrine, it does not remain or abide within the doctrine of Christ. That teaching that comes from him. and another congregation extends its fellowship to that congregation, then, just as on an individual basis they become morally culpable, the same would be true of congregations. If this congregation extended fellowship to a congregation out here teaching that doctrine of homosexuality is acceptable to God, we would be morally culpable. We would be separated from God because we were extending fellowship to that individual. We would be lost even as them. And thus, to remain in fellowship with a congregation that has separated itself from the teachings that Christ gave is to be in sin ourselves. Instead, we must withdraw our fellowship from that apostate congregation. But, of course, all of this is seen throughout the book of 2 John, and as we went through at the very beginning of this, the emphasis of John on truth and our obedience to truth and our walking in truth. To walk in truth, to keep His commandments, to remain within the doctrine of Christ, you have to get in the doctrine of Christ. You have to begin walking according to truth. John found this elect lady's children walk in truth. Are we walking in truth? To walk in truth, you have to obey the gospel of Jesus Christ. As we mentioned this morning, upon our faith, repenting of our sins, making the confession of our faith in Jesus Christ, and being baptized in water for the forgiveness of our sins. Then we walk in that truth. We walk according to the commandments that are found within the pages of the New Testament. And as we walk in that way, we have fellowship with God, and we continue to have fellowship with God. If we get out of that doctrine, out of that teaching, we're no longer walking in truth, then we no longer have God. We no longer have the Father. We no longer have Christ. We're no longer in fellowship with Him. If that's your situation this evening, then why not repent of your sins and come back and once again have fellowship with God by walking in the truth, by abiding within the doctrine of Christ. If you need to come this evening, we would encourage you to do that as we stand and sing this invitation song.